On a cold night in February, 5 young men inexplicably left the safety of their car and struck out into the woods in the dead of night. It would be months before their bodies were found. Known as America's own Dyatlov Pass incident, we're left wondering what happened to the boys from Yuba City.
A nauseating, sickly sweet smell hung in the air as the riders pulled off the main trail and entered the deserted camp. It was early June in 1978, and the late afternoon sun was bathing the stunning Californian wilderness in an iridescent light and warmth. They had been travelling all day and had decided to pull over for a rest and to investigate the curious cluster of abodes tucked away in a cul-de-sac just beyond the tree line adorning the mountain road. In front of them sat a large trailer, which was surrounded by 4 smaller ones. It was a US Forestry Service station. Its location was not unusual. Many more like it dotted the landscape in this part of the world, strategically placed to help the Forestry Service carry out their duties in all kinds of situations, such as search and rescue or fire spotting. Most of them are staffed, but in the more remote regions, many of them sit unmanned and are only used when needed, as was the case with this particular camp. The sickly sweet scent was more pungent now that the riders had removed their helmets. A couple of them had recognized it immediately. It was the smell of death. They reasoned that maybe a dead animal was lying close by, rotting in the heat of the afternoon and stinking out the whole area. It was enough to make one of them gag, and they briefly considered leaving until one of the men noticed that a window in the larger trailer had been broken and decided to go and investigate. Looking in through the pane of broken glass, he could not see anything of interest, just a number of cupboards and work surfaces, seemingly untouched. Surprisingly, the door to the trailer was unlocked, and after some deliberating, the rider decided to enter, but nothing could have prepared him for what he discovered inside. Lying on a bed at the rear, under 8 winter blankets and a swarm of blowflies, lay a dead body. What none of the men present that day realized was that they had just stumbled upon what would become a truly heartbreaking enigma, which you, the viewer, has probably never heard of. Authorities en route to the scene already had a hunch regarding the identity of the deceased individual, and upon arrival, their worst fears were confirmed. It was the body of one of 5 young men who had gone missing earlier that year in February. But much of the evidence in front of them just didn't seem to add up. In fact, as the full story unfolded, it would turn out that hardly anything about this case made sense at all. And in time, what we would be left with is a thought-provoking mystery which has come to be known as America's very own Dyatlov Pass incident. With that in mind, we take you back to the very beginning, the early evening of Friday, the 24th of February, 1978. The day had been chillier than usual for the residents of Oroville in Northern California. It was 5:30 p.m. and 25-year-old Gary Dale Mathias was sat at his kitchen table eating dinner. Between gulps of his meatloaf, he looked out of the window at the empty street in front of his house with an eager expression. He must have felt tremendously excited about that night's prospects. For several days, he and a group of friends from the nearby town of Yuba City had been planning to watch a basketball game at the California State University in Chico. Even though a light snowfall had been forecast that evening, Mathias assured his mother and stepfather that he would not need his windbreaker, since he would be home once the game was over. Earlier that evening, 32-year-old Theodore Earl Weir had come rushing downstairs for dinner, which he consumed at an alarming rate. A few minutes later, he heard the sound of a car pull up outside and honk. Weir instantly rushed out of the door after insisting to his grandmother, Imogen, that he too would not be needing his coat that night. In the driveway, he found Jack Anton Madruga, 29, sitting behind the wheel of a 1969 Mercury Montego. In the passenger seat sat his other friend, Jackie Charles Hewitt, who was 24, and sitting in the back was 27-year-old William Lee Sterling. Weir jumped in the vehicle and he and his friend set out for Oroville, where they picked up Gary Mathias. From there, they headed out on a 2-hour-long journey towards Chico, on what promised to be an eventful evening of sports and cheerful exuberance. Each of them was an avid basketball fan, and they loved to watch both local and televised games whenever they got the chance. They even played as part of a team themselves, the Gateway Gators, and in fact, had a match set for the very next day, the 25th, the latest in a series of regional tournaments which would qualify them for the upcoming Paralympics. They were promised a free trip to Los Angeles if they won the game. An aspect which made this case especially poignant was the fact that all 5 men were either intellectually disabled or suffered from mental health issues. They attended the Yuba City Gateway program, a vocational rehabilitation centre where they learned trades whilst playing on the centre's basketball team. Ted Weir was the oldest, yet had the mind of a child and had a natural friendliness about him, which he often shared with the deeply religious Bill Sterling. At his family's insistence, he had recently quit a job working at a snack bar due to concerns that he was unable to handle the high-pressure workload. Jack Hewitt, on the other hand, was the shortest of the group, standing at 5 feet 9 inches. His head drooped slightly, and he found it difficult to respond clearly in social situations, but when comfortable, he had a natural cheerfulness and got along famously with his friends. Weir and Hewitt were described as inseparable and went almost everywhere together. The older man took protective care of his younger friend and would often make phone calls on his behalf. Jack Madruga had graduated high school and served in the army in Vietnam, but was discharged after a medical evaluation. Although not diagnosed as intellectually disabled, he was generally considered slow by his acquaintances. Despite this, Madruga was competent enough to possess a state driver's license and loved driving his cherished Montego almost as much as he loved playing basketball. Like Madruga, Gary Mathias had also enlisted in the army and had been stationed in West Germany, but following a drug-related breakdown in 1973, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and honorably discharged. For this reason, he had been taking prescribed medication for nearly 5 years. In that time, his condition had improved greatly, and he had even managed to hold down a job, working for his stepfather's landscape gardening service. Finally, completing the group was Bill Sterling. Like Ted, he also had the mind of a child and rarely left the house for anything other than church, basketball, or attending the program. Ted would often phone Bill to read him bizarre newspaper articles or repeat amusing names found in the phone book, which both of them found highly amusing. Sterling also devoted time at the local hospital, reading Bible verses to patients on the wards. During the ride, the 5 friends talked amongst themselves. Conversation was largely centred around their upcoming match. Their parents had laid out their kit on the evening of the 24th, ready for their big game the next day. Sadly though, they would never get to play it. For that night, a mysterious sequence of events would seal an inexorable fate in which none of them were ever seen alive again. When all 5 boys failed to return home that evening, their worried families contacted each other and the police for any word on their whereabouts. It was unheard of for the boys to vanish without saying anything. None of them were the outgoing type and would often spend their nights at home. Although Gary Mathias tended to stay out late with older friends, this was out of character, even for him. When the police issued a bulletin for the missing boys, it was not long before the news arrived in Chico, where the first pieces of the puzzle began to come together. Several witnesses confirmed seeing them at the basketball game, and 1 or 2 believed they had seen Madruga's Montego leaving the parking lot after its conclusion. A cashier at a local store reported seeing them come into his shop just before closing time. They purchased several snack items, bottles of milk and soda, and then left almost as quickly as they had arrived, just as snow was starting to fall. Police immediately began a countrywide search, headed by Yuba Police Lieutenant Lance Ayres. Ayres had known the boys for years, having gone to high school with Ted Weir and his brothers, and felt personally connected to all five. He worked extensively to find any trace he could, and instructed the search to broaden into the surrounding areas near the Feather River mountain range. This decision eventually paid off when the news filtered back that Madruga's Montego had been discovered. To Ayres' surprise, the car was located on a road in the Plumas National Forest, 70 miles away from Chico, on the 28th of February. Snow had fallen in the time since the disappearance, which had almost buried the vehicle, but oddly enough, they found it had been left perfectly parked. Inside, they discovered a number of snack wrappers strewn over the seats. There were also 4 maps folded neatly in the glove compartment. The car itself was in good condition, but the keys were missing, forcing the officers to hotwire the ignition in order to drive it back to nearby Oroville. There was even a quart of petrol left in the tank, which confused the police, as it was more than enough for the boys to have driven home on. With mechanical failure and lack of fuel ruled out as a reason to abandon the vehicle, authorities wondered if it had gotten stuck in the snow, but this also turned out not to be the case. Further attempts to search the area were halted by another snowstorm later that night, and the search was reluctantly delayed until the spring. For Ayres, the investigation became an obsession, and with each passing day and no word on the boys, he became increasingly determined to find them. To this end, he and their families pursued every angle they could, even offering rewards for information on their whereabouts. Phone calls came in daily, but most were unconfirmed sightings by unsure citizens, ranging from as far as San Francisco, Arizona, Ontario, and one which even claimed the boys were spotted in Florida. With each frustrating phone call, Ayres was becoming convinced that no one would ever see them again. And just when that possibility was seeming more and more likely, a breakthrough finally occurred on the 4th of June, when he received a phone call from the group of motorcyclists at the US Forestry Service camp. The body found inside the trailer was identified as that of Todd Weir, who looked to have died from exposure, despite having been wrapped in several layers of blankets. Initial reports also showed that Weir's 200-pound frame had shed more than 80 pounds, tragically hinting that he may have starved to death. But when investigators took a closer look at the scene, they were baffled. Weir's shoes were missing, and frostbite had ravaged his exposed feet. The length of his unkempt beard suggested that he had been alive for the better part of 8 weeks, but for some reason, he had never once tried to leave the bed. The officers found several empty packets of Army C rations scattered about the floor, which suggested he had eaten at some point. They also found an unlocked metal cabinet in the same room, containing dehydrated, easily prepared food sitting untouched, enough to feed a small group of people for a whole year. When Ayres examined the scene, he was stunned to find that no one had attempted to build a fire. There were boxes full of matches and plenty of paperback books and magazines, which could have been used as fuel. Even more astonishing, the propane tank behind the trailer was in perfect working condition, yet no one had turned it on. This would have provided heat for a few weeks at the very least. The following day, Plumas County Police found the body of Jack Madruga 11 miles from the trailer, near the road leading back in the direction of the car. All signs indicated he had died on the way and that his body had fallen victim to animal predation. He had been dragged almost 10 feet to a nearby stream, with most of the flesh on his right arm gone, his hand clutching his favourite watch, and his eyes and 2 fingers missing. On the other side of the road, in a thickly wooded area, police also found several bones scattered about, which later analysis proved belonged to Bill Sterling. Sterling's body had also been eaten by forest animals, and his remains were spread over an area of 50 square feet. Several articles of clothing, matching what he had worn the night he disappeared, also confirmed his identity. When word reached Yuba City that 3 of the 5 boys had been found dead, the news was devastating. 2 days later, Jack Hewitt Sr. joined the search, despite Ayres' pleas not to, and tragically located a backbone and the same Levi jeans and shoes his son had been wearing the night he vanished. The following day, an assistant sheriff discovered Jack's skull, and the family dentist confirmed his identity using the boys' dental records. Throughout this, Gary Mathias's whereabouts remained unknown, and this worried investigators, since he had been taking prescription medication for his schizophrenia. 4 months had passed since the group's disappearance, and if he was still alive, they couldn't begin to imagine what sort of state he was in. Mathias's shoes were discovered in the trailer, suggesting to police that he had been there with Weir and had swapped them out for his friend's much larger leather shoes once frostbite had swollen his feet. To this day, Mathias's body has never been found. Police speculated that the boys had driven up the road but had become lost, and as the snowfall worsened, they abandoned the car and tried heading in a southerly direction back home. This meant they would have walked more than 20 miles over rocky, mountainous trails in freezing cold weather before arriving at the service trailer. Once inside, the boys would have tried searching for food and something to start a fire with, but in the end could not get one started and had simply failed to locate the food in the locker. With no idea about the propane tank outside, and with Weir's worsening condition confining him to the bed, Hewitt, Madruga and Sterling might have left to locate assistance, leaving Mathias behind to keep watch over their friend. If they had left around the time the blizzard hit on the 28th of February, it would have been their last mistake, as none would have made it back alive. If Mathias had indeed stayed behind, with no word from the other 3 men, he might have set off at a later time. A quarter of a mile northwest of the trailer, officers found 3 blankets and a rusted torch. They speculated that Mathias might have gone out to locate his friends and give them the blankets, but got lost in doing so and succumbed to the elements, although there was nothing to substantiate this. Needless to say, the question on everyone's lips was why had they driven up that mountain road in the first place? It was not on the same road connecting Chico to Yuba City. None of the boys had ever travelled on that road before, nor would they have been familiar with the area, despite the fact that Weir and Sterling had been on hunting trips to nearby trails as children. Just how had they ended up there of all places? Madruga's mother would later claim that someone or something chased them up that mountain trail, but she couldn't believe that anyone would have gotten the upper hand on them. Although they had their disabilities, they were 5 very strong, able-bodied men who could more than handle themselves. Police questioned what had compelled them to leave the relative safety of a perfectly operable car and trek for 20 miles through a forest on a freezing cold night in the first place. They also wondered why, upon reaching the trailer, the boys had not tried to start a fire or ransack it for supplies, unless they were trying to hide. But hide from who? Or what? Given their intellectual disabilities and mental health issues, it has been suggested that maybe they just didn't understand how to cope with the situation. But if Mathias, and to an extent even Madruga, who had both served in the army, had been with them, then surely they would have been more capable and should have known what to do. Unsurprisingly, rumours of foul play surfaced around the time the bodies were discovered, and one person's account on the night of their disappearance might shed some light onto the sequence of events. On the 2nd of June 1978, Lieutenant Ayres spoke to a man named Joseph Shons, who reported that on the night of the 24th of February, he had actually been driving along the same road where the Mercury Montego was later discovered. Shons' Volkswagen Beetle had got stuck in the snow, and he suffered a mild heart attack whilst trying to dislodge it. This forced him to spend the night in his car. As he convalesced, he awoke at around 2 a.m. to the sound of strange whistling nearby. He looked out of the window and reported seeing several men and a woman holding a baby, backlit by a pair of car headlights, about 100 feet away. Hoping to get assistance, Shons called out for help, but instead, the men and the woman rushed back towards their car and the lights vanished in an eerie silence. Later that same night, he was awoken again by lights at his window and more whistling noises, but didn't know who or what was responsible. At 5 a.m, Shons ran out of fuel and his car engine, which had been keeping him warm, cut out. He was forced to walk back to a lodge 8 miles down the trail in the freezing cold. Along the way, he noticed the Montego sitting quietly on the road, but thought nothing of it at the time. Shon's story appeared to fit with several early reports of men allegedly confronting the 5 boys in the parking lot at Chico University. People at a nearby lodge in Brownsville believed they had seen the boys stop by to make phone calls, but without proper leads and no further information, his testimony did not lead to anything further. There is speculation that not everything was as it seemed, and if closer examination of the evidence is made, a much darker picture is painted. Posting on a blog in late 2017, a person claiming to be Hewitt's sister-in-law relayed several pieces of information which were not reported in the press at the time. She believed that the 5 men had witnessed an altercation between a woman and another group of men at the basketball game. They had gone to her aid, which had led to a hostile confrontation. Consequently, she claimed Gary Mathias was thrown off a bridge and died from the fall, while his friends panicked and fled for their lives, ultimately driving up the mountain trail and getting lost in the woods. Another small detail, which was apparently left out of reports at the time, was that shell casings were found at the entrance to the mountain road. Had someone shot a gun at the car as they fled? If so, how do we explain the fact that the boys visited a store to buy snacks? This hardly seems like the actions of a group fleeing from an adversary, unless this happened before the chase commenced. Unfortunately, this possibility only raises more questions than answers. There have been many theories regarding what happened that night, from Mathias having a mental breakdown and coercing his friends into going up that road, to alien abduction or Yetis attacking them in the dark of the forest. As we said before, this case has come to be described as America's own Dyatlov Pass incident, and it's easy to see why. There are striking similarities between the two. Both occurred in the month of February and involved a group of people leaving the safety of a shelter, running off into the wilderness and becoming separated before dying from exposure to the elements, and with no one in the aftermath understanding why. The boys from Yuba City, although grown men, were anything but. With the exception of Mathias and possibly Madruga, they had young, innocent minds, and in many ways were just children. What makes this case so terribly heartbreaking is that we cannot even begin to imagine what their families must have felt and must still be feeling to this day, especially as the events which led to their deaths remain unexplained. Our only hope is that they rest in everlasting peace and that one day their families get the answers they have desperately been searching for.